This is a recording of the book, The Law and the Promise, the second chapter. The Law and the Promise, of course, by Neville Goddard, and I'm reading the second chapter. We have in the background what is some advanced alpha, relaxing, isochronic music that we're reading. That's an alert state, alert frequency. And so, reading chapters out of this particular book, The Law and the Promise by Neville Goddard. I'm Dr. Dennis L. Waters Sr., and I'm reading a few chapters out of this book, seeking to do the entire book for you so that you have it as a point of reference. Again, these books by Neville Goddard, we can send you copies of the book, The Law and the Promise, the one that's dealing with the word and the command, your word, your command, and then the 5 lessons or 5 sermon series. Consciousness is the only reality is one of them. No one to change but the self, assumption hardened into facts, thinking fourth dimensionally, all of those inside of this particular 5 lesson series that we're doing on Blog Talk Radio and on Spreaker, on the podcast as well. And so we want to encourage you to do this, and then also to send you the Spiritual Strategic Life Planner so that you write down what it is that you want to bring about in your life. And all of these things that we can do in order to help you, to benefit you, to bless you, as far as changing your life per your desire to change your life. We speak of the 4D life. The first D is, of course, that you have a desire for something better, a desire for a different life. That's vital. That's the first step. So that's the first D. And so now, the Law and the Promise, the second chapter. The chapter is entitled Dwell Therein. Dwell Therein by Neville Goddard. Beginning. There's a quote from George Herbert. It is, in quotation marks, we have this statement. My God, I heard this day that none doth build a stately habitation, but he that means to dwell therein. What house more stately hath there been, or can be, than is man, to whose creation all things are in decay. Close quotation marks. George Herbert. Neville. I wish it were true of man's noble dreams, but unfortunately, perpetual construction, deferred occupancy, is a common fault of man. Why build a stately mansion unless you intend to dwell therein? Why build a dream house and not dwell therein? In this particular reading of this, there are quotation marks around build a stately mansion, or a stately habitation rather, and around dwell therein. And so he says, why, in quotation marks, open quotation, build a stately habitation, close quotation mark, unless you intend to, open quotation, dwell therein, question mark, close quotation. Why build a dream house and not, open quotation, dwell therein, question mark, close quotation. This is a secret of those who lie in bed awake while they dream things true. They know how to live in their dream until, in fact, they do just that. Man, through the medium of a controlled waking dream, can predestine or predetermine his future. This imaginal activity of living in the feeling of the wish fulfilled leads man across a bridge of incident to the fulfillment of the dream. Of course, when he's saying man, he means man and woman. He's speaking of humans. If we live in the dream, thinking from it and not of it, then the creative power of imagining will answer our adventurous fancy, and the wish fulfilled will break in upon us and take us unawares. Man is all imagination. Therefore, man must be where he is in imagination, for his imagination is himself. To realize that imagination is not something tied to the senses or enclosed within the spatial boundaries of the body is most important. Although man moves about in space by movement of his physical body, he need not be so restricted. He can move by a change in what he is aware of. However real the scene on which sight rests, man can gaze on one never before witnessed. He can always remove the mountain if it upsets his concept of what life ought to be. This ability to mentally move from things as they are to things as they ought to be is one of the most important discoveries that man can make. It reveals man as a center of imagining, with powers of intervention which enable him to alter the course of observed events, moving from success to success through a series of mental transformations of nature, of others, and himself. So, Neville is speaking here of the power of imagination and what one can do with one's imagination. And he says that basically a person is not tied to what he sees or senses with all five of his senses, or she is not tied to that. Not tied to what is enclosed within the boundaries of the mind, or not the mind, but the brain that is enclosed within the skull or the cranial. Not bound by that. Not closed or bound within the body. He can move by a change of what he is aware of or what she is aware of. No matter how real the scene on which the sight rests, what your eyes are looking at, your physical eyes, you can gaze on something you've never witnessed before. Beyond what is seen on the television, beyond what is seen in the movies, beyond all of that, you can create something. As a matter of fact, you can use those tools in order to empower yourself to dream a new dream. And that's powerful. When used correctly, all that is available to you can be used as a tool to construct your own reality, your own desire. And then he gives an example. For many years, a doctor and his wife dreamed about their stately habitation, going back to the quote. But not until they imaginatively lived in it did they manifest it. Here is their story. So Neville is giving an example here of someone who tested to prove whether or not his trainings worked, which is what we're asking you to do today. Test it to see if it works. So here's the story. Some 15 years ago, Mrs. M and I purchased a lot on which we built a 2-story building housing our office and living area. We left ample space on the lot for an apartment building, if and when our finances would permit. All those years we were busy paying off our mortgage, and at the end of that time had no money for the additional building we still desired so much. It was true that we had an ample savings account which meant security for our business, but to use any part of it for a new building would be to jeopardize that security. But now your teaching awakened a new concept, boldly telling us we could have what we most desired through the controlled use of our imagination, and that realizing a desire was made more convincing without money. we decided to put it to a test, to forget about money, in quotation marks, and concentrate our attention on the thing we desired most in this world, the new apartment building. With this principle in mind, we mentally constructed the new building as we wanted it, actually drawing physical plans so we could better formulate our mental picture of the completed structure. Notice what they did now. They mentally constructed it in their minds, but then they went another step. They made physical plans. They drew out physical plans to better formulate it in their minds, to have a better mental picture. They wrote it down. They made it definite. Continuing, never forgetting to think from the end. In our case, they said, the completed occupied building. So they didn't just want a building. They wanted completed and they wanted occupied, an apartment building that was occupied. We took many imaginative trips through our apartment house, renting the units to imaginary tenants, examining in detail every room and enjoying the feeling of pride as friends offered congratulations on the unique planning. We brought into our imaginal scene one friend in particular. I'll call her Mrs. X, a lady we had not seen for some time, as she had given us up socially, believing us a bit peculiar in our new way of thinking. In our imaginal scene, we took her through the building and asked how she liked it. Hearing her voice distinctly, we had her reply, "Doctor, I think it is beautiful." One day, while talking together of our building, my wife mentioned a contractor who had constructed several apartment houses in our neighborhood. We knew of him only by the name that appeared on signs adjacent to buildings under construction. But realizing that if we were living in the inn, we would not be looking for a contractor, we promptly forgot this angle. Continuing these periods of daily imagining for several weeks, we both felt we were now fused, F-U-S-E-D, fused with our desire, and had successfully been living in the inn. Fused, they began to fuse with the idea. They were feeling it. One day a stranger entered our office and identified himself as a contractor whose name my wife had mentioned weeks before. In an apologetic manner, he said, I don't know why I stopped here. I normally don't go to see people, but rather people come see me. He explained that he passed our office often and had wondered why there wasn't an apartment building on the corner lot. We assured him we would like very much to have such a building, but that we had no money to put into the project, not even the few $100s it would take for plans. Our negative response didn't faze him, and seemingly compelled, he began to figure and devise ways and means to carry out the job, unasked and unencouraged by us. So the man starts planning to build an apartment, even though he wasn't asked, even though he wasn't encouraged. He came by without an invitation. Then, for them, forgetting the incident, we were quite startled when a few days later this man called, informing us that plans were completed and the proposed building would cost them $30,000. We thanked him politely and did absolutely nothing. We knew we had been living imaginatively in the inn of a completed building, and that imagination would assemble that building perfectly without any outside assistance from us. So we were not surprised when the contractor called again the next day to say he had found a set of blueprints in his files that fitted our needs perfectly with few alterations. This, we were informed, would save us the architect's fee for the new plans. We thanked them again and still did nothing. Logical thinkers would insist that such negative responses from prospective customers would completely end the matter. Instead, they say, 2 days later, the contractor again called with the news that he had located a finance company willing to cover the necessary loan with the exception of a few $1,000s. It sounds incredible, but we still did nothing. Can you imagine that? They did nothing. Why would they do that? But remember, to us, this building was completed and rented. And in our imagination, we had not put one penny into its construction. The balance of this tale reads like a sequel to Alice in Wonderland. For the contractor came to our office the next day and said, as though presenting us with a gift, "You people are going to have the new building anyway. I've decided to finance the balance of the loan myself, if this is agreeable. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers, and you can pay me back out of the net profits from the rentals." This time, they said, we did something. We signed the papers, and construction began immediately. Most of the apartment units were rented before final completion, and all but one occupied the day of completion. We were so thrilled by the seeming miraculous events of the past few months that for a while we didn't understand this seeming flaw in our imaginal picture. But knowing what we had already accomplished through the power of imagining, we immediately conceived another imaginal scene, and in it, this time, instead of showing the party through the unit and hearing the words, "We'll take it," we ourselves, in imagination, visited tenants who had already moved in that apartment. We allowed them to show us through the rooms and heard them pleased and satisfied, speaking such with their comments. And 3 days later, that apartment was rented. Our original imaginary drama had objectified itself in every detail except one. And that one became a reality when 1 month later our friend Mrs. X surprised us with a long overdue visit, expressing her desire to see our new building. Gladly we took her through, and at the end of the tour heard her speak the line we had heard in our imagination so many weeks before. As with emphasis on each word, she said, "Doctor, I think it is beautiful." Our dream of 15 years was realized. And we know, now we know, that it could have been realized any time within those 15 years if we had known the secret of imagining and how to, in quotation marks, live in the inn of desire. But now it was our own money into it. We had not put one penny of our own money into it. But now it was realized. Our own big desire was objectified. And we did not put one penny of our own money into it. That's how it was realized. By imagining. They did not put one penny of their own money into it. Through the medium of a dream, a controlled waking dream, what individuals call a lucid dream, the doctor and his wife created reality. They learned how to live in their dream house, as in fact now they do. Although help seemingly came from without, the course of events was ultimately determined by the imaginal activity of the doctor and his wife. The participants were drawn into their imaginal drama because it was dramatically necessary that they should be. Their imaginal structure demanded it. They do. Although help seemingly came from without, the course of events was ultimately determined by the imaginal activity of the doctor and his wife. The participants was drawn into their imaginal drama because it was dramatically necessary that they should be. Their imaginal structure demanded it. In quotations, all things by law divine in one another's being mingled. And then he says, the following story illustrates the way in which a lady prepared her stately habitation by imaginatively sleeping in it or dwelling therein. So another story from that one. A few months ago, my husband decided to place our home on the market. The main object for the move, which he had discussed with her husband many times, was to find a home large enough for the two of us, my mother and my aunt, in addition to 10 cats, 3 dogs, and 1 parakeet. Believe it or not, the contemplated move was my husband's idea, as he loved my mother and aunt and said I was at their house most of the time anyway, so why not live together and pay one tax bill? I liked the idea tremendously, but I knew that this new home would have to be something very special in size, location, and arrangement, as I insisted on privacy for all concerned. So at the moment, I was undecided whether to sell our present home or not. But I didn't argue, as I knew quite well from past experience with imagining that our house would never sell until I stopped sleeping in it. 2 months and 4 or 5 real estate brokers later, my husband had given up on the sale of our house, and so had the brokers. At this point, I had convinced myself I now wanted to change. So for 4 nights in my imagination, I went to sleep in the kind of home I would like to own. On the 5th day, my husband had an appointment at a friend's home, and while there met a stranger who just happened to be looking for a house in the hills. He was, of course, brought swiftly back to see our house, which he walked through once and said, "I'll buy it." This didn't make us very popular with the brokers, but that was all right with me, as I was happy to keep the broker's commission in the family. We moved within 10 days and stayed with my mother while looking for our new home. We listed our requirements with every agent on the Sunset Strip only because I wouldn't move out of the area. And each one of them, without exception, informed us we were both mad. It was entirely impossible, they said, to find an older home of English style with 2 separate living rooms, separate apartments, a library, and built on a flat knoll with enough ground space to fence for large dogs and located in one particular area. When we told them the price we would pay for this house, they just looked sad. I said that wasn't all we wanted. We wanted wood paneling all through the house, a huge fireplace, a magnificent view and seclusion, no close neighbors, please. At this point, the lady agent would giggle and remind me that there was no such house. But if there were, they would realize 5 times what we were willing to pay. But I knew there was such a house, because my imagination had been sleeping in it. And if I am my imagination, then I had been sleeping in it. By the 2nd week, we had exhausted 5 real estate offices, and the gentleman in the 6th house was looking a little while when one of his partners, who had not spoken until then, said, "Why don't you show them the place up Kings Road?" A third partner in the office laughed sourly and said, "That property isn't even listed. And besides, the old lady would throw you off the property. She's got 2 acres up there, and you know she wouldn't split. Well, I didn't know what she wouldn't split, but my interest had been aroused by the street name, for I liked that particular area best of all. So I asked, why not just take a look anyway, for laughs? As we drove up the street and turned off into a private road, we approached a large 2-story house built of red wood and brick, English in appearance, surrounded by tall trees and sitting alone and aloof on its own knoll, viewing the city below from all of its many windows. I felt a peculiar excitement as we walked to the front door and were greeted by a lovely woman who graciously asked us in. I do not think I breathed for the next minute or two, for I had walked into the most exquisite room I had ever seen. The solid red wood walls and the brick of a great fireplace rose to a height of 28 feet, terminating in an arched ceiling joined together by huge redwood beams. The room was straight out of Dickens, and I could almost hear Christmas carolers singing on the balcony of the upstairs dining room, which looked out over the living room. A great cathedral window gave a view of sky, mountains and city far below, and the beautiful old redwood walls glowed in the sunlight. We were shown through a spacious apartment on the lower floor with connecting library, separate entrance and separate patio. 2 staircases led upward to a long hallway opening into 2 separate bedrooms and baths. And at the end of the hall was, yes, a second living room opening out onto a second patio screened by trees and redwood fencing. Built on 2 acres of beautifully landscaped grounds, I began to understand what the agent had meant by saying she wouldn't split, for on 1 acre stood a large swimming pool and pool house, completely separated from the main house, but undoubtedly belonging to it. It did indeed seem to be an impossible situation, as we did not want 2 acres of highly taxable property, plus a swimming pool a block away from the house. Before we left, I walked through that magnificent living room once more. Going up the stairs to the dining room balcony, I turned and looking down saw my husband standing by the fireplace, pipe in hand, with an expression of perfect satisfaction on his face. I placed my hands on the balcony railing and watched him for a moment. When we were back in the real estate office, the 3 agents were ready to close for the day, but my husband detained them, saying, "Let's make her an offer anyway. Maybe she will split the property. What can we lose?" One agent left the office without a word. Another agent said, "The idea is ridiculous." The agent we had originally talked to said, "Forget it. It's a pipe dream." My husband is not easily annoyed, but when he is, there's no more stubborn creature on earth. He was now annoyed. He sat down, slammed his hand on the desk and roared, "It's your business to submit offers, isn't it?" They agreed that this was so, and finally promised to submit our offer on the property. We left, and that night, in my imagination, I stood on that dining room balcony and looked down at my husband standing by the fireplace. He looked up at me and said, "Well, honey, how do you like our new home?" I said, I love it. I continued to see that beautiful room and my husband in it, and felt the balcony railing gripped in my hands until I fell asleep. The next day, as we were having dinner in my mother's house, the telephone rang, and the agent, in an unbelieving voice, informed me that we had just purchased a house. The owner had split the property right down the middle, giving us the house and the acre it stood on for the price we offered. The initials on this are JRB. In quotation marks, open quotation, dreamers often lie in bed awake while they do dream things true, close quotation marks. One must adopt either the way of imagination or the way of sense. No compromise or neutrality is possible. He who is not for me is against me, to quote from Jesus the Christ. When man finally identifies himself with his imagination rather than his senses, he has at long last discovered the core of reality. I've often been warned by self-styled realists that man will never realize his dream by simply imagining that it is already here. Yet man can realize his dream by simply imagining that it is already here. That is exactly what this collection of stories proves. If only men, or we could say if only men and women were prepared to live imaginatively in the feeling of the wish fulfilled, advancing confidently in their controlled waking dream, then the power of imagining would answer their adventurous fancy, and the wish fulfilled would break in upon them and take them unawares. Nothing is more continuously wonderful than the things that happen every day to the man with imagination sufficiently awake to realize their wonder. Observe your imaginal activities. Imagine better than the best you know, and create a better world for yourself and others. Live as though the wish had come, even though it is yet to come, and you will shorten the period of waiting. The world is imaginable, not mechanical, not mechanistic. Imaginal acts, not blind faith, determine the course of history. Come, and you will shorten the period of waiting. The world is imaginal, not mechanistic. Imaginal acts, not blind faith, F-A-T-E, determine the course of history. That's the end of chapter 2 of the book, The Law and the Promise.